You're listening to Beyond the Sermon, the podcast of First Methodist Church in Collingswood, New Jersey. Our goal is to not only share our sermons with you, but to go beyond the sermon with conversations about what we're learning and what God is doing in our lives and in our community. During the summer of 2022, we are in a series called The Songs of Summer, a study in the Psalms. You can find out more information about our church at fumccollingswood.org. Thanks for listening. Feels a little weird for this to be the first time I'm up here seeing your faces this morning. But this morning we're jumping back into our summer series, The Songs of Summer. And in this series, we're leaning into the book of Psalms. So we're preaching from the Psalms. We've had a couple, even though we've had a couple special messages these last few weeks with Josh speaking with us and Jeremy sharing from his testimony last week. But the rest of the summer, you're going to be hearing a lot more from the Psalms. But we're not just preaching from the Psalms. If you've noticed, we've been using the Psalms as part of our corporate worship and our readings together. And we've taken up a reading plan that's taken us from Psalm 1 all the way to 150 between July 3rd and September 4th. We're getting all of them in. And if you haven't been reading along with us, it's never too late to start. We're about a third of the way through, but you can join up with us anytime along the way. There's nothing that says you have to go back and catch up and read all of the 50-some Psalms that we've read to get to this point. You can go home and read Psalm 56 and 57 and 58 today. That's our readings for today. And if you want to, there's a couple more of the reading plans here in the sanctuary. You can find them on our website, fumccollingswood.org, and you can join up with us even from this point on. So in this series, we are looking at how we can choose to worship God, and we can put our trust in Him no matter what we may be feeling or experiencing. We connect with these Psalms because the Psalms reflect and express the realities and the tensions that are common to each of us. And the Psalm that was read for us today, Psalm 13, it's one of those Psalms that, if we're honest, it expresses something that I think we've each felt at some point in our lives. In it, the psalmist cries out, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever?" Have you ever been there? How long will you hide your face from me? Have you had times where God's felt distant, far away, like He's looking at everybody else but not at you? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and every day have sorrow in my heart? Have you ever felt trapped and alone inside your own head or heart? Have you experienced sorrow? Not just sadness, but that deep sorrow that we find in life sometimes. Do you feel like you spend too much of your days or even your nights fighting against your own thoughts, fighting against the lies that feel awfully true? The psalmist says, "How long, Lord, will you allow will my enemy triumph over me?" And we don't like to think that we have enemies. That doesn't sound very Christian, does it? But have you felt like you've had to sit back and watch as someone else gets ahead when you know that they don't really deserve it? Or they've hurt you along the way to get to where they are? Does any of that resonate with you this morning? Can you relate to what the psalmist is saying? Does it feel familiar? I know it does for me. Some of you know by now that during our first term in Uganda, we were involved in a car accident in which a young boy lost his life. And that experience wrecked me. I think quite literally it broke my heart. A lot of what happened over the days that followed that accident feel like a blur. I can remember sitting in a Ugandan police station wondering what was going to happen. If you've ever sat in a police station, it's not a very comfortable experience. Imagine one with no air conditioning and a tin roof. It's not a very comfortable experience. I can remember lying in bed in the days that followed, crying out to God and asking Him why, and playing the what if game. You ever play the what if game with God? Going over every detail and decision that was made that led to the event that happened, wondering what could have been different if even one small choice out of the million of different places that a different choice could have been made had been made. What if this? What if that? What if we had left 10 minutes later? What if our visas hadn't been delayed? What if, what if, what if? We saw a counselor once in Kampala in those immediate days after the accident, but then we were back to our home in a little town called Arua, which was 8 hours away, and we began to make plans to return back to the States a little earlier than we had anticipated our term ending so that we could attend a week-long intensive counseling program. We went to that counseling program, and it was helpful, don't get me wrong, but at the end of it, there was still a lot of pain. There was still a lot of questions that I had. There was still a lot of healing that needed to take place within my own heart, and a lot of work that needed to be done to get there. But I didn't know that. No one said, here's your next step. Here's what healing should look like. Here's what it could look like. This is when you'll know you're okay. And so I thought after that week of intensive counseling, that was as good as it was going to get. That was the pain, the questions that I felt, it was part of my cross to bear for Christ. And I thought that I had to bear it alone. The only way I could figure out how to do that was to just shut off my heart entirely, so I wouldn't feel the pain quite as sharply. Has anyone ever been in that situation? But when you shut off your heart to the pain, the reality is you shut off your heart to everything, to the joy, to love, to the people that you love. And you trade peace, which is what you're looking for numbness. So we ended up back in Uganda after a couple of years and another baby. And the reality is that the return to Uganda didn't change the realities in my heart. I was still trying to deal with the pain by not feeling anything at all. And that choice impacted my relationships, especially those with my family, eventually what had started as a little crack between me and Meg, because I felt like I had to bear it alone, and not even she could understand what I was feeling. Began to feel more like a chasm. And we realized we couldn't stay in ministry and do the work that we needed to do for ourselves. We couldn't stay in ministry and continue to get the kind of counseling and help that we needed to get, so we resigned from our mission agency, and they helped us get into a different intensive counseling program. And it was there that we began to get down to the root of the questions that I was asking, to get down to the root of the pain and the healing that I needed, to begin to heal what had been broken within me. All that to say, I can relate to the author of Psalm 13, to the questions that he was asking, the emotions that he was feeling, and the sense of abandonment that he was experiencing. And I'm so grateful that God chose to put this psalm into Scripture, that God put this psalm into the revelation of who he is to us, because it shows us that it's normal to have these kinds of experiences, and it's okay to feel these kinds of emotions. It's okay to ask these kinds of questions that oftentimes just feel too big. But God can handle our feelings, and he can handle our questions. And I love that in this psalm, that's not the whole of the psalm. That's not where the psalmist stays. It's not where he ends up in his writing. So I want to take a few minutes and look at what else the psalmist says to us this morning, and what we can learn from Psalm 13 that can help us when we go through those kinds of similar experiences that leave us hurting and with questions and looking for where God is working in the midst of what we're experiencing. And I think the first thing that we can see in this psalm that can help us is in verses 3 and 4. The psalmist says, "Look on me and answer, Lord my God, give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. And my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall." When we feel that we're in the dark, when we feel close to death even, when we feel defeated, it matters who we bring our questions to. That's the first thing I think this psalm tells us. Who are we looking to even in the midst of our distress? In the psalm that we read responsively earlier in the service, Psalm 121, we read the words, "I lift my eyes up to the mountains. Where does my help come from?" Or other translations, you may have heard it read before, "I lift my eyes up to the hills. From whence does my help come from?" And you see, it was on those hills, on those mountains, those high places, that the pagan gods were worshipped. That's where the altars were built to Baal and where the Asherah poles were set up. So the psalmist is not saying, when I look to the mountains, I'm reminded of God's strength. What he is saying is, when I look to those high places, to those false gods, I recognize there's nothing there. But my help doesn't come from those places. My help comes from Yahweh, the true God, the God who made not only those mountains where those false gods are worshipped, but everything in heaven and earth. And while today we may not be tempted to look to Baal and Asherah, there are a million places that we can be tempted to take our questions when we're in the midst of distress, especially when things are difficult. We can take our questions to other people, looking to them to give us the validation that we long to receive, for feeling what we're feeling in the midst of that situation. We can take our questions to the people around us, but we can also take our questions to the culture that we live in, looking for an explanation, how the world would explain the things that we're going through, how the world would explain how we should deal with those situations. We can look to our culture for a narrative that will give our experience some kind of meaning. But we can also keep those questions to ourselves, afraid to ask them because we're afraid of being the weird ones or the unspiritual one or the broken one. We can keep our questions to ourselves because we think no one will understand what we're going through, and no one will be able to handle those questions that we're asking. But we're not alone in having these questions. And hopefully Psalm 13 can help us to see that God isn't afraid of us asking these questions. And so we don't need to be either. Hopefully in sharing some of my story, it can open the door for you to acknowledge and share your own stories, to walk through those difficult things. I count it a privilege as a pastor when I have the opportunity to sit down with people and they choose to entrust me with their story, to give them a chance to walk through the midst of those questions. Not that I always have the answers. Oftentimes I don't. Not that I can ever change a given situation. But to help you know that you're not alone in the midst of them. And there are good Christian counselors and therapists and psychologists out there, and there is nothing wrong with going to them to get the help that you need. Whether that's therapy or even medication, it doesn't make you unchristian. I mentioned that the second time we went to a counseling intensive and the healing that started to be ushered into my life and my relationships there. But that intensive experience also led to months and months of weekly counseling with a counselor that I still connect with from time to time just to check in, work through things. There's no reason to be ashamed when we have questions, and there's no reason to be ashamed if we need to seek professional help. But it matters who we take those questions to when we are in distress, who we entrust our story to, who we look to for answers and meaning in the midst of the situations in which we find ourselves. But God's not afraid of those questions. And now, on this side of all that I've been through, neither am I. The other thing that I see here in Psalm 13, what it's teaching us is this: in the midst of the distress or even despair that we find ourselves, it matters what or who we cling on to in the midst of that. Verses 5 and 6 say, "But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me." The writer acknowledges all that he's been experiencing, the pain, the hurt, the fear, the questions. And then he begins the final section of this psalm with the word "but." It's not that he's denying the reality that he has just described or minimizing the impact that it was having on him and on his life. But he's choosing, even in the midst of all of that he's going to lean on the truth. He's going to lean on the truth of who he knows God to be. And he chooses to trust God in the midst of it. He reflects on who he knows God to be. And he says he's known God to be a God of unfailing love, a God who saves, and a God who is good, even though right now he's not feeling it. And it doesn't feel true in the experience that he's going through. So he makes it a willful choice. Not just a choice of the emotions because it reflected what he was feeling, but a choice of his will about how he's going to respond. And he says, I will sing the Lord's praises. Not I might, and not when things change, and not if God does X, Y, and Z. He says, I will sing God's praises because I know he has been good to me. He's choosing to focus on God's character and his nature rather than what he's experiencing in that moment. Knowing that the loving God who has saved him in the past is able to save him in the present. And even if he doesn't, what he's done for him in the past is still worthy of praise. Now, I can almost promise you that if you haven't experienced a time or a season in your life where God feels far off, you will at some point. At some point in your life, you're going to go through something. And the reality of God isn't going to match your emotions. It's not going to match the reality that you're experiencing. But every time you go through a season like that, you have a choice to make about how you will respond. Who will you take those questions to? And will you trust that who you know God to be is who God will continue to be, even over what you are feeling in the moment? You see, God's not scared by your questions. He's not put off by your questions. He's bigger than all that. He can handle them. He's the one who's faithful and true, and you can trust him to be who you know him to be, even when it doesn't feel true. In a moment, Will and Christine and Alden are going to come, and we're going to sing about how Christ is our living hope. And I don't know what all the unclimbable mountains that you are facing are today. I don't know what dark shadows you need God to tear through this morning. And I don't know what sin and shame you're carrying this morning, but I do know that Jesus Christ is the one who sets us free. And Jesus is the one who has defeated death. He's the one who can break every chain. He's the one who saves. Jesus is the one who heals and restores. And he is our living hope. And you can trust him, even when that doesn't feel true.